Hi guys, it's Amy. Today we're gonna make some little shells, chocolate shells that are filled with a raspberry rose caramel and topped with a macadamia crumble and freeze-dried raspberry Krispies. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is get our mold prepared. So I'm using a square mold. You can use circular ones if you want. However, we want something that's gonna stand up, so it has to have a flat bottom. So the first thing we're gonna do is polish the molds. I use a little bit of vodka on cotton wool. So you don't want to use too much here, and if you do, as you can see, I've used a little bit too much vodka. You just come back with a clean cotton wool and just sop that vodka up that's in the mold. It will evaporate if you give it long enough, but we don't want it drying against the mold, so do get in there and clean it up before you start. This will ensure that you get nice, shiny finish to your chocolate, and it removes any kind of bacteria or excess cacao butter that's unnecessary from the mold as well. All right, the next step is to make our shells. So we're gonna pop a little bit of tempered stone ground dark chocolate into a piping bag, and we're gonna pipe this into each individual cavity. So when you're piping into the mold, do make sure that you fill the cavities right to the top. We want these to be totally full shells. All right, now that it's filled up, we're gonna give it a tap to get rid of any kind of air bubbles that might be in there and settle the chocolate down. We're gonna leave this in for a little bit longer than we might usually if you were just gonna do something where you were filling it into the cavity of the mold, the filling. But because we're gonna use these as little cups, we want it to be a touch thicker, so we're gonna leave it a little bit longer than we might normally. All right, then when you're ready and you feel like the chocolate's got a good shell on the outside of it, tip it over and give it a tap with the plastic side of your scraper. Don't use the metal side. And once you feel like all the chocolate's pretty much removed from the mold doing that, then you're gonna give it a scrape across, get rid of all that excess chocolate on the mold, and clean your scraper on the bench as you go so you're not accumulating chocolate on the mold again. Give it another scrape until it's nice and clean. It doesn't have to be perfect at this stage. You can scrape it again in about 30 seconds to a minute once it gets a little bit soft. So just pop it on the side there. And then before you put it in the fridge, give it one more scrape just to get rid of anything else, any other kind of excess chocolate on the outside for a nice clean finish to the shell. So then pop that in the fridge and let it set until it comes out of the mold. So it's about 5 to 10 minutes. And now you can see they come out really beautifully, clean little shells. All right, now that the shells are done, we're gonna pop those to the side while we make the raspberry coulis. For the raspberry coulis, I'm using previously frozen raspberries. So if you have fresh ones at home, you can freeze them first and then use them. The reason I do this is because you get beautiful juices that come out when they're frozen and then they're thawed. So we're gonna get that into the pot with our maple syrup. You can also use xylitol or agave or honey or whatever sweetener you'd like to use. I would stay away from coconut sugar as it's gonna deepen that flavor and also darken the coulis up a little bit. So we're gonna bring it to a soft boil. We don't want it boiling too much. And then we're gonna reduce it down to a simmer and then leave it at a simmer until it's reduced by about half. So you can see here now how it's reduced down quite substantially. You could even go a little bit further than this if you wanted to. I'm now gonna run it through a sieve over a bowl. I'm using a bench scraper to bring it through the sieve because it's really the quickest way of doing it. So the purpose of doing this is just to remove the seeds. If you get to this stage and you feel like it's not quite thick enough, you can still sieve it, put it back on the stove, and really gently simmer it until you get a really thick coulis. Now transfer this into a jar if you're not using it straight away, and then it can sit in the fridge for about a week until you use it. Okay, now we have our elements ready for making the raspberry rose caramel, so let's get started on that part. First, we've got our melted cacao butter, our melted coconut oil. I'm using deodorized so that we have a beautiful raspberry flavor that comes through and we're not getting a coconutty background, but it's totally up to you if you want to use deodorized or just normal coconut oil. And then in terms of sweeteners for this, I'm using maple syrup. This is a light maple syrup, so it keeps the color light, but also the flavor. You could replace it with honey if you wanted to. In addition to maple syrup, I'm also using some powdered xylitol. Now, I powder up all my sweeteners because I use them in chocolate. They don't have to be powdered, but it does help the texture quite substantially if you powder it first. We've got some lemon juice here for a bit of freshness and tartness. Acid will help balance out this recipe. For the rose flavor, I'm using a really beautiful rose medicine flower extract from medicine flower and a raspberry medicine flower extract just to boost that raspberry flavor. You could also use a little bit of vanilla in here if you wanted to, but I wanted the rose and the raspberry to really just sing. Now we've got everything in the jug, let's get it blended up. So we're gonna turn it on low speed, and as you can see it start to come together, you're gonna turn the speed up a little bit. If your coulis is cold from the refrigerator, it's gonna take a little bit longer to do this as we're gonna need to build up some heat in the Vitamix in order for it to melt down again. What's gonna happen is the coulis is gonna set against, well actually the cacao butter and the coconut oil are gonna set against the coulis, and it's gonna seem as though it's firming up and getting too thick, but it's actually just getting cold. So you can either let your Vitamix run for about 30 seconds and tamper it, or you can put it on the stove and on very gentle heat just to melt it down a little bit and then put it back in your blender. The ideal thing would be to use your coulis at room temperature. And now you can see there's a beautiful shiny finish to this, and it's nicely emulsified. So we'll transfer this over to a piping bag and then pipe it into our shells, filling it almost to the top, about 3/4. We're just gonna finish these with a little bit of a macadamia crumble. So I just took some macadamias and pulsed them up in the food processor, and some lovely crisp freeze-dried raspberries. Now, as a little note on the freeze-dried raspberries, you don't want to put those on until you're ready to serve them because they will go soft being exposed to the air. And there we have our beautiful raspberry rose cups with macadamia crumble and freeze-dried crispy raspberries. All right, that's it. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.